Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Paueru Dialogues number 6, Reconsidering Land, History, and Belonging. My name is Sammy Marsh, and I am the program coordinator at Pal Street Festival Society. I am Yonsei, fourth generation Japanese and mixed European settler. Like many others, I am a visitor on these lands. While we meet today virtually, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land and its keepers. I'm currently speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. It is an honor and privilege to learn from and with these communities of these lands and waters. As a settler and newcomer to this land, I strive to deepen my understanding of Indigenous knowledge and teachings, to listen and learn. The bravery, resilience, and wisdom of elders and knowledge keepers continues to inspire me and greatly shapes my understanding of community. Both within my work at the Pal Street Festival Society and in my daily life, I commit myself to the struggle against the systems of oppression that have and still dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands and rights to self-determination. I see this most visibly in our work in the Downtown East Side, but these struggles persist globally and are essential to human rights across the world. Wherever you are, please join me in a moment of reflection. Consider the land you are on, and I hope in doing so, we can move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today, we are talking about our relationship to and with land, communities, and history. Our guest hosts and panelists come from rich and diverse backgrounds, grounded in community organizing, art, and storytelling. Thank you for coming on this journey with us as we explore the complexities of our identities, responsibilities, and interconnectedness. This series is possible thanks to the financial support of Hopped Collaborative, SFU's David Lamb Center, Canada Council for the Arts, BC Arts Council, City of Vancouver, individual donors, and in-kind support from the Bulletin Magazine and Element IQ. Before we start, some housekeeping notes. We are recording the guest presentations, and these will be available on Pal Street Festival's YouTube. You can turn your camera off at any time if you wish to remain private. There will be a Q&A portion right after the panelist presentations. So at any time, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. Those will be asked to our panelists, moderated by our guest host. Also, I want to stress our priority today is to hear from everyone during the breakout groups. We are inviting you into a circle, but we have contextual and technical constraints. So we've asked the facilitators in each group to be a bit tough with time management. We apologize in advance. As participants, we ask you to be active, generous listeners and to value everyone's perspective. Should you wish to share more thoughts after the event concludes, we've set up a discussion page on our Facebook. You will find it on the Paueru Dialogues event page. Now, I'd like to introduce our guest host today, Shou, a writer and researcher. Shou's creative practice is grounded in diasporic shimanchu consciousness. He is committed to cultivating space to tell difficult and complicated stories, and in hopes of dismantling the separation and stagnation that informs the world he was born into. Thank you, and over to you, Shou.
All right, thank you so much, Sammy, for that introduction. I hope everyone's keeping cool. I know that the heat wave is coming on us, so it's a time to sort of just take in that heat and try and keep cool. So really looking forward and grateful for Pal Street for providing the space for this conversation today. I normally like to sort of ramble and see where it takes me, but I actually somehow got moved to sort of actually put some words together that I'm going to read. This is the first time I think I've ever done that in my life, so I don't know what changed, but I want to try and keep it brief so that we can give the panelists as much time as possible, because I think they have a lot of really amazing things to share. So the settler population in Canada is coming to terms with what Indigenous nations have known all along, putting into motion a long overdue process of recovering and returning home the spirits and bodies of those children whose lives were lost to the residential school system. Today, I'm speaking from Wasanish and Lekwungen territories. Here on Vancouver Island, there were 5 residential schools that I'm aware of. Housekeeping, Alberni, and Christie residential schools on the Channel territories, St. Michael's and Alert Bay and Kwakwaka'wakw territory, and Cooper Island, closer to Victoria, where I am, on Coast Salish homelands. Many settlers and non-Indigenous folks have expressed shock that something so violent could happen here in Canada. I think this shock comes from the belief that Canada is inherently peaceful or a generally well-meaning place. But for Indigenous communities, there is nothing shocking about what has taken place. Indigenous people have been speaking of this violence over and over and over again. I want to say that this violence isn't a couple of bad apples or a few people who did wrong or even an experiment that went wrong. It is intentional, it is systematic, it is genocidal, and it is this country operating exactly how it was designed to operate. This violence forms the historical foundations of our memory and the current protocols of our government. The residential school system has morphed into the foster care system and the current education system, both of which uphold and continue the genocide against sovereign Indigenous nations. These are systems that are built on ripping Indigenous youth from their families and knowledge bases. While as Japanese Canadians, these deaths might seem rather unrelated to our daily lives, I want to underscore that the death of these children was and is required for us as settlers to occupy these lands and live our lives in the way that we do today. The near death of many Indigenous languages was and is required for us to normalize speaking English and French the way we do today. The mass removal of Indigenous people from their territories was and is required for us to acquire property, buy land, accumulate resources and money, and generally live our daily lives as we do as Japanese Canadians. As Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans, one of the stories that we hold close is our own historical dispossession from land and property and our incarceration during the Second World War. But I also think it is important to ask collectively how we came to acquire this land and property that we were dispossessed from, and how did we come to believe it was rightfully ours to own in the first place? When we talk about our history of settlement on this continent in relationship to the white man, we might say, we are so proud that our ancestors came to this continent as hardworking fishers and stoic farmers in the face of brilliant white hatred. But if we look to Indigenous communities, the story might change. And we might say, we came into someone else's earth body with no permission to harness and take ownership of land and resources to build lives of empire and concrete. I want to know what it means to have, for the most part, never asked for nor received consent from the Indigenous nations to exist and build our lives on these territories and waterways. I speak of these things not to call forth guilt or denial, but to help hold the difficult truths that form our lives so we can envision a world that is based on restoring good relations. Now is the time for Japanese Canadians and Asian settlers on this continent to think about our responsibilities and how we can take action. The means, abilities, and privileges we each have are vastly different, but we all have a stake in bringing this work forward. If we have a stable income, a solid place to live, intergenerational wealth, steady access to food and leisure activities, I believe we have a responsibility to redistribute the wealth and resources in our possession. This is not an act of charity or a donation, but an act of reparation. And I've come to see in my life that quite often the more money we have, the less generous we are with sharing it. I want to ask how we can collectively encourage each other to do better. If we own property, how can we develop new ways of thinking about our relationship to land? How can we restore Indigenous sovereignty to lands we occupy? Seattle and San Francisco, through Real Rent, Duwamish, and Sogorea Land Trust respectively, have developed organizations where settlers pay rent and help restore land to Indigenous communities. I dream of a world where we all work to establish better relationships of deep consent for our bodies, for our communities, for the plant and animal beings, for our ancestral spirits, and for the waterways and lands we live on. To no longer expect everyday violations of our personhood, I dream of having more time and energy to move slow, to pause, to not be caught in the rush that is capitalism and settler time. I dream of rediscovering bounty and killing the narratives of scarcity and fear that cause us to hoard resources. I dream of seeing Indigenous languages flourish and native plant species ecosystems take over manicured city lawns. I dream of a world where we can reach back into the stories we tell about our own family histories and communities and think about what it means to consider Indigenous peoples and laws, not just as a land acknowledgement, but as a part of the very fiber of our being, our histories, presents, and futures. I believe this work is urgent, but is also slow and meditative. It must be done with care and courage, making sure to compensate Indigenous folks for their labor, emotional, physical, or otherwise, and not demanding them to perform their trauma for us. It involves deep listening. It involves taking up less space. It involves finding wealth in our ability to give up power, resources, and land. And perhaps most of all, it involves remembering how to restore the flow of love and care in order to create a world where we don't leave anyone behind, that our worth will be based not on what we produce or own, but on the very fact that our existence is sacred. So, the name of the event, Reconsidering Land, History, and Belonging. All these things are heavy. They're things that weigh on us. They're things that can keep us up at night, live in our bodies. And so, I ask that anyone call any ancestors who you want to support us on this journey and, to come with an open heart and mind. I think that the three panelists are people that have both allowed me to think through what I just shared and allowed me to believe in sort of new worlds being possible. I definitely have a cynical side and I can get caught in things. And so I think that, I'm really grateful to be able to hear and share their teachings in the context of Powell Street Festival. So, I want to just pass it over because we're going to start with a good friend of mine, Nicole Yakashiro. Nicole is a PhD student in history at UBC, and I think, from Nicole, I've really learned about how to sit in difficult places. I think that a lot of times it's easy to sort of give a land acknowledgement, or it's easy to sort of, perform how we think we're supposed to feel, but it's difficult to really sit in what that actually means. And so every day, I think I learn how to look at history differently from Nicole. And so she's going to share some of what she's learned from her research about property. So I'll pass it over to her for her to start off.
Thanks, Sho. I'm going to share my screen really quick here. Okay, does it all look good, normal? Awesome, and you can all hear me, great. Okay, and Sammy and whoever's doing the chat, do you mind just throwing in my link to the Google Doc for the transcript? So I know there's live transcription on here, but in case anyone wanted to download or read along just for accessibility reasons, there's a link that'll be put in the chat for you. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sho, for hosting this event and for your powerful introductory remarks, as always. And thanks for also for asking me to be a part of today. I'm really honored to be on this panel with Mahlikah and Paulette. So thank you all for being here. And a huge thanks to the PSF team for supporting us and being so organized and great about everything. I'm speaking to you from the unceded and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I was born and raised on Stalo territory where my family continues to live. And I'm actually going to be going there shortly after this. And this is where this photo was taken with my little grandpa in the background on the land. And I want to begin with this photo because I want to acknowledge that while a lot of the things I'm talking about today might seem abstract, in truth, they are deeply grounded and they're very material. And so I just wanted to start with that. So today I want to talk about a story. It's a common story we tell about Japanese Canadian history, and it's a story about property. It is about possession and ownership and the loss of that ownership and possession. I think many of us know this story well. In 1943, the federal government initiated a process of dispossession that lasted throughout the decade. The properties that the government was obliged to protect by law on behalf of Japanese Canadians were forcibly sold without the consent of their owners and on the basis of race. This is a story of dispossession, and it's an important one. It's one I've been concerned with for some time now, but I want to suggest today that it is too often lacking. And this lacking both narrows our ability to understand our history and our relations in this place. It also forecloses opportunities to find the type of belonging that I think, without being too presumptuous, that a lot of us are still searching for. So in order to unpack what I mean here, I thought I'd share a personal story, admittedly partial, because we don't have a ton of time, of how I came to question these stories about property and property in general in the first place. So in 2015, I began as a researcher for the Landscapes of Injustice project. For those of you unaware, this is a massive history project approaching its completion this year, headed by the University of Victoria to investigate the history of the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. And this was a transformative experience for me. For the first time, I came to know my family's history and soon met some of my all-time favorite people, including Sho, who I met when he was driving me around for the project. There is much to be valued about this endeavor. I'm sure a good number of you have had the opportunity to look at the archive they recently launched, which gives families the opportunity to look at the dispossession records. But throughout my years on the project, questions were continually raised within the community and by scholars, many of them Japanese Canadians, about how the project was framed. What were the implications of centering private property ownership in our research? What did it mean to quantify property losses in this way and to highlight the most spectacular losses of property owners, such as those of Kagetsu over others, such as renters? And I've just highlighted here an article that was published as part of the project, and they highlight Kagetsu, who is this multi-million dollar, who lost millions and millions of dollars. And that was some of the first research I did on the project. So here's some questions I have following those. Who and what do we miss when we center and elevate property ownership and its loss as the framework for historicizing injustice? Who and what do we miss when we focus on property without unpacking what property does and has done in settler colonial Canada? In short, does property influence our relationship to place, land, and our history? With the support of my friend Will Archibald and my supervisor, Dr. Laura Ishiguro at UBC, I became invested in these questions. But I didn't always think like this. I remember when I had my first archival encounter with my family's dispossession records working for the project. My grandpa and his family lived in Maple Ridge before the war as farmers. And for most families who own property in the Fraser Valley, the federal government collected a ton of information to facilitate the dispossession. And among those records were tables of family things, maps of farms, and sometimes photographs. I remember finding this map here of the Yakashiro property and attaching myself to it, trying to see some sort of connection, trying to imagine my grandpa when he was a kid roaming around and working on the farm, and I was imagining possession. But the more time I spent with the map and the more time I reflected on the feelings I had surrounding this encounter, the more I realized that this impulse to possess actually obscured more than it revealed. It obscured, for example, the histories of the Wanak, Kwantlen, and Katzie First Nations, whose land this property was carved out of. And I began to question where my impulse to possess came from. The project supported these types of interactions. They actually fed on it. They wanted Japanese Canadian families to interact with their former properties and have an emotional experience. But something felt really disingenuous about my drive to attach myself to this piece of property as a person of great economic stability and privilege. I started to see that this small encounter I had was actually reflective of a broader pattern in Japanese Canadian history and in the community more broadly, and that impulse was to possess, to reclaim, to repossess as a form of remembering what was lost. But questions kept creeping up. At what cost and at whose expense? What and who does the impulse to possess places like my family's farm and even places like Powell Street erase or obscure? Possession takes on strong meaning after dispossession, that I understand. But today I want to propose that we seriously question the frameworks of possession and property that we use for telling our histories, for remembering, and for relating to place, as Show earlier pointed to as well. Private property, as it has been used in Canada and in Japan as well, is rooted in the dispossession of Indigenous people, a process that is ongoing as settler property continues to be prioritized over Indigenous title, sovereignty, and lives. Property was and is a central mechanism to remove Indigenous peoples from their land and to make room for non-Indigenous people to claim property based on the ways they could quote unquote improve the lands and thus give it economic value. This was a racist process. Non-white people were often marginalized from it, and because Indigenous people were not considered able enough to improve and bring economic value to the land, Europeans justified their colonization of Indigenous lands in the name of liberal individualism and capitalism. In a distinct but related way, the dispossession of Japanese Canadians also used these racist ideas about who had the right to own property in Canada. So why do we continue to use these same frameworks and logics that dispossess and dispossess Indigenous people? I think often of a New Canadian article from 1943 that I wrote about with Laura and Will, who I mentioned earlier, and I also wanted to thank Carolyn Nakagawa, who actually shared it with us originally. So a writer from the New Canadian wrote that Japanese Canadians who were being uprooted during the 1940s have, quote, suffered such damage to spirit and morale that they are closer to being Indian reservation material. The fear of becoming Indian reservation material here was, in other words, a fear of becoming propertyless, a fear of being excluded, a fear of not belonging to Canada's liberal settler society of individuals who own property. This fear is warranted to a large extent, but how we choose to respond to this fear is important. Do we choose to seek recognition within Canada's capitalist property regime? Or do we choose to question the very injustice of the reserve system and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the first place? We must move beyond the fear of being excluded from Canada. And we must move away from orienting ourselves toward whiteness and property logics, as Shoa suggested, and recognize that true healing and belonging come from alternative forms of relations. And I understand that thinking of a world without property seems far-fetched. But I also think we need to think in far-fetched ways to make the transformations we want to see. Divesting from property logics means everything from giving land back to Indigenous communities to everyday actions, such as Kage's example in one of the earlier dialogues, when they spoke about sharing community gardens with unhoused people instead of being possessive or controlling over the gardens. So in conclusion, I wanted to leave you with some words here. I take inspiration from scholar Brenna Bandar when she urges us to think of how to, quote, resist contemporary forms of dispossession without replicating the logics of appropriation and possessiveness that are rooted in capitalism, colonization, and racism. She tells us that in order to make the most radical transformations, we must listen to and foreground Indigenous scholars and activists and knowledge holders, as well as the property-less in our effort to form alternative relationships to land and move beyond possession. Thanks so much.
All right, can y'all hear me again? Good. Okay, thank you so much for that, Nicole. I think that I know for me, just like being born into a world where it was just assumed that you could own land is something that's like built into my blood and built into understanding. And so I think really thinking about other ways to be and exist is really important, and it's a challenge, but I think it's really like it's just crucial. So thank you for sharing those. So up next, I want to invite Mahlikah Awe to the stage. And Mahlikah, I was thinking about sort of just like all the different teachings I've received from her, and I think one of the things about the ways that we've been educated is that everything becomes a line, and so we move from past to present, we move from bad to good, and we just sort of like it's just very rigid, it's very straight, it's very clear. And I think Mahlikah has really helped me embrace a spiral. And I think a spiral is a model that's cosmic. It's something that's the universe, and it's something that returns us to our ancestors. And it's something that really like just, you know, instead of thinking we're always having to get better or we're always moving for progress, it really is just like this thing that returns us back to being in our bodies and being alive. And I think that, you know, I'm, you know, super grateful for these teachings. And so Mahlikah is a Haudenosaunee Mi'kmaq poet and activist and community organizer with Afro-Indigenous roots. And so she's prepared a really amazing presentation. So I'll hand it over for her to talk next.
Gono Lunkwa, love you, show. Nyalgoa, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I'm just gonna share my screen. What, Karen? So, Sego, Skanangoa, Mahlikah Awe, Enml'ga't, Saqama'sgw, Untitled, Watgaho Oswego Ti Karando. So hello, I carry the peace. My name is Mahlikah Awe. My spirit name is the one who stands and walks in the light. And I am coming to you from Ti Karando, Toronto, Ontario, where the trees stand in the water. I'm Wolf Clan. And this is the traditional homelands of many confederacies, including the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Huron-Wendat, and is currently, you know, a Treaty 13 relationship between the Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the city of Toronto. So I am going to offer Agwego Agwa da Ongwe and all my relations way of seeing our relationship to the land and to each other. And I'm going to begin with a quote from Richard Wamagus's Embers, an amazing book that I would recommend. I've been considering the phrase all my relations for some time now. It's hugely important. It's our saving grace in the end. It points to the truth that we are all related, that we are all connected, that we are all belonging to each other. The most important word is all. Not just those who look like me, sing like me, dance like me, speak like me, pray like me, or behave like me. All my relations. That means every person, just as it means every rock, mineral, blade of grass, and creature. We live because everything else does. If we were to choose collectively to live that teaching, the energy of our change of consciousness would heal each of us. and heal the planet. And I really believe that. This digital image is one of my installative pieces that I created at the beginning of the pandemic, when I found myself feeling very disconnected from place, from my community, from the land. And so in lockdown, I rummaged through my space and I found things that reconnected me in that web of life that we are all a part of. And so all my relations is really a part of my being, but it's also how I move through the world with my arts practice, my activism, and as an educator. One of the things that helps ground us in all my relations is when we go back to the relationship that Indigenous peoples have always had to their homelands. This is before the settlers came. Many nations had visual agreements that were spoken in ceremony, what we call wampums. This is the wampum of the land in which I am currently situated, the one dish, one spoon here in Tikarando. This reminds us that home is not just a place, but a promise that the nations made to each other and they made to the land. That we will only take what we need from the dish, that we always leave something in the dish for someone else and others, that we always leave the spoon in the dish so that the next generation can sustain themselves, and that we will always keep the dish clean. And so I wonder what has happened to our notion of stewardship, stewarding each other and stewarding the land that we're on. That is an all my relations way. I also would recommend Braiding Sweetgrass. This is an incredible book of teachings that connect us to the land. And I chose some of my favorite quotes. Wealth among traditional people is measured by having enough to give away. Scarcity and plenty are as much qualities of the mind and spirit as they are of the economy. Gratitude plants the seeds for abundance. Each of us comes from people who were once Indigenous. We can reclaim our membership in the cultures of gratitude that form our old relationships with the living earth. And finally, from this book, I fear that a world made of gifts cannot coexist with a world made of commodities. And this is why our people are fighting so hard to keep those pipelines out of our territories. The commodification of land is a direct correlation to the commodification of our bodies, of our communities, of our ways of being and knowing. Often when I'm asked to work in community, particularly to offer some guidance around reimagining our relationships to each other and to the land, I have a 4-part journey, and this is part 1 that I'm going to share. It's thinking about reimagining reclamation. What are my ancestral roots to colonialism? How have I internalized the trauma my ancestors experienced? How have I benefited from the oppression my ancestors inflicted on others? And how has my complacency contributed to the present day erasure of Indigenous people and Indigenous lives? And so if we ask ourselves these questions, we can begin to re-indigenize the way in which we see our past and present connections to these lands that we call home. I have some links that I think can be placed into the chat that highlight some of the work that I've done as a lead artist working with this notion of place and home in various communities through the arts, and how that has been very uplifting and eye-opening in this conversation around all my relations. So I'm going to close with the only way I know how, which is spoken word. This image is a digital art piece that I did, which goes with this poem called Untitled, The Place in the Sky. Because as Indigenous peoples, as Sho mentioned, we are cyclical. And so when I'm thinking about my relationship to things, I'm thinking about 7 generations into the past, 7 generations into the future, and who I am in this moment. Galun Hayage, the place in the sky. They maneuvered purposely, direct, unabashed, skengananananan, skengananananan, seeking their power, yearning for home, unrooted from memory, unhinged from expectation. They spoke to their power when they turned on their light. Gawis, the act of forgiveness as an act of healing, is home. Gawis, the unsettled voice, never irrelevant, for it has survived, is home. Gawis, creativity as medicine, healing our wounds as we share our stories over and over and over again. Over and over and over again is home. The fight in our blood and the fight in our bones, the war in our blood and the war in our bones is home. This fight, this war gives us the strength, the relentless resolve to weave the innards, the faceless forgotten fragments to piece together the emptiness, scraps of scars and severed tongues, scraps of scars and severed tongues to weave our worth back into existence. As we rise above a Nohwala shell, we gaze to where Sky Woman fell, and our gaze goes back to Galun Hayage, the place in the sky. And we are reminded that the journey begins by looking within to where I am now and where I have been, to where I am now and where I have been. And we remember that we are connected to all things. And in this way, there can be no separation between us, even when we are apart. Nyawagoa, Walomtik, big thanks. I really am looking forward to our next panelist, and I'm so grateful to be joining you today. Onagiwai.
Thank you so much, Mahlikah. It's been a minute since I've heard your words, and they just hit right in here, and that's exactly what I needed. So thank you. It felt like a clearing out of things that were in my lungs, and so I can breathe again. So thank you. So our last panelist is Paulette Moreno, and I often think of the coast, going down is like a spine, the ocean and where the ocean and the land meet is a spine. And I think that the borders that we've, put in the spine has made it difficult for us to just send messages up and down that coast. And so Paulette, I have a personal connection because my grandfather grew up in Juneau, Alaska, and Paulette's grandfather also was in Alaska, and they worked in a restaurant together. And so I think part of the story is thinking about how when we build communities that sometimes we're contained to national borders. And so, what is the relationship between what's now BC and what's Alaska? And so, Paulette is someone who has taught me how to hold Indigenous histories and Japanese histories together in her bloodline, and to not compromise on either of them, and to speak very clearly. So I'm really grateful that she's going to be sharing some words with our community today. So I'll pass it over to her right now.
Gunashish, which is thank you, Gunashish, for the Pal Street Festival, for all those who are with us today, for the presenters who went before us, for the elders who are with us, and amongst all, the powerful presence of our children. As we come together at this time, it is good to be amongst you. I'm of my mother's people, the Kline D, raven dog salmon from the village of Okwan, Yoxt Hit, the Dipper House, in that part of the universe. I'd like to acknowledge my opposites, the Kagwantan. My Tlingit name is Tek Unyek. I am a woman of Tlingit ancestry, Japanese ancestry, and Hispanic ancestry. As Sho has mentioned, on the top back row, the third man from the left is Mr. Tanaka. The fourth man is my grandfather, Kamichi Miyasato. I would like to acknowledge Shikakwan, the land in Sitka, Alaska, the clan's land of who I'm on, Tlingit Ani. I'd like to acknowledge the land that you are on, that you are our visitors to, or your ancestral homelands, wherever they may be. We all come from the DNA of galaxies and universes. We are all unique hues of light. We are all people from cultures and ancestry. We are organized in divine patterns of perfect original order. The next slide or the next picture shows words that look like letters. These shapes of letters, these shapes that you see show a traditional homeland. I am up towards the left-hand side where it says Tlingit Ani. In Sitka is the English name, but this is known as Shikakwan. My ancestral homeland is from Auk Bay, not far from Sitka. I would like to acknowledge the words that are here and the people that are from these different areas. And I would like to acknowledge the over 200 children that were taken from the First Nations community whose lives were cut short simply because the lightness of the hue of how and who they came into the universe was questioned and even disturbed. There's an unbalancing that has taken place amongst the world of the cultures that we come from, of the people who we are and where we stand. We come from the DNA of galaxies, universes, and unique hues of light. When disturbed and when unbalanced, these letters that form the words that you look upon right now are powerful forms of peoples. We knew nothing of a border. We never created the border between Alaska, what is known now as Alaska, and Canada, the First Nations. As Native people, we never drew this border. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is my great-grandfather, Kamichi. This is hope. Hope of a life, hope of a time, and hope of a dream. Next slide, please. This is my grandfather, Kamichi, to the left, my auntie, Edith. This is my mother at 14 years old, and her mother to the right, Mary, and her brother, Ben. In the middle, as we look upon and gaze upon my mother, half Japanese and half Tlingit. Beauty truly is in the eyes of the beholder. Beauty truly is nothing to be judged. You are an original person. Those who live on Powell Street, those who live in indigenous lands, thank you so much for acknowledging all of the nations that exist. They say in the United States there are over 500 different indigenous tribes or peoples. The First Nations also has several hundred. So you are in good company as you stand solid on this ground. You are in good company as you stand with us. As my mother was figuring out the world at this time, this was after her eldest brother and her father were taken to Minidoka and to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Next slide, please. This is my great-grandmother, Annie Dachua, and this is in Klawock, Alaska. She is Tlingit, and these are her three daughters, my aunties, Alice, Ede, and my mother, Harriet. This is in a small village in Alaska. These smiles that they have this time, I believe, are because she shielded them. If you look at her look, her stance, she is shielding those. There are those who went before each and every one of us that are in this collection and gathering of people who have shielded us, who have shielded us like she's doing even in this picture. My mother and my aunts and uncles being half Japanese and half Tlingit in their villages on the land and the shores that produced so many beautiful natural things such as salmon and berries and halibut and medicine. Next picture, please. Why? My mother many times would go back to a little child during the war when her brother and her father were taken. Why would be the question that she would ask. When we made this journey back, this was the first time that we were in Minidoka. As she looked upon this, there were so many questions in her heart. There were so many things that were taking place, knowing that they had once lived there. Next slide, please. I take a moment to say to you today and to gather with you today to say, there is nothing, there never was and there never will be anything that is wrong with how and who we are as we came into this world with different hues of light, with different balances of energy. Mom, nobody had the right to judge you. Nobody had the right to take my father into boarding schools from 4 years old to 18 years old. Mama, nobody had the right to make you feel less because of your Japanese heritage. Nobody had the right amongst all who is gathered here with us today on these indigenous lands to say anything to you that was not that would not match the glory of the mountains and the sea and the berries and all of the beautiful medicine that this indigenous land provides. This land provides goodness. When you and your ancestors came here, it was, I believe, our intention, and it still is, to share goodness and beauty and love with what you create. It was never the intention of the native indigenous people of this land to see any culture, any peoples hurt. Mama, don't believe them. what they said to you when you were a little girl, when they came in with that power and that piece of paper, when they said this language to you that was an unnatural language that divided, that did not come together, Mama, don't believe them. If you take the slides off now, please. Thank you. So my message here today in sharing with you at this beautiful time, the Japanese people and the indigenous people, we are in this together, just like the waves of an ocean that's moving. We are in this together, and there is a natural rhythm with us. As you come forward, I hope your hearts are touched. I know mine has been by the powerful people who have presented before us. And I know that as we come forward, our voices will sustain us. Our cultures are full of love, and nobody has permission ever to treat you more than the magnificent beings you are. And there was nothing, and there never ever will be anything wrong with our spirituality. Our spirituality on how we come here, who we are, where we come from, and where we're going is perfect. It is in perfect order. As you create your communities on this land, as you create the festival, as you go forward, our young people, you have the blessings of our ancestors. We are a kind and a gracious, yet a fierce and a powerful people. And our spirits, our ancestor spirits, will defend you. We will defend you. We will do that spiritual battle for you. To our elders who are amongst us, who have been incarcerated, no longer. You are not. To the children whose over 200 voices, whose bodies were be found, we cradle you and we hold you in our arms. That lullaby you never heard, our indigenous people, our native peoples had lullabies that were so beautiful for the children to hold them up. We hold you. And to the Japanese community, indigenous communities around the world, and to those that are here amongst us today, we will create, we will stand, and we will stand together. And the only permission is your permission to be who you are and to celebrate the galaxies that you come from, the space that you come from, the universe, and the uniqueness of you. It is a perfect order, a perfect pattern of light. Love to each and every one of you this day. And create, it's okay. And guna chish for acknowledging where you stand, acknowledging the land that we are on. Gunesh Chish. Thank you.
Ashish, thank you for that. All right, so we have a bit of time for questions. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask the panelists? I can start if no one has anything right off their mind. I'm just keep thinking about this idea of wealth and how we have so much scarcity in the world, but also so much potential to sort of build new forms of wealth. And so I guess I'm wondering if anyone has any, also if there's anything you want to say to any of the other panelists, but if you have any sort of advice for people on thinking about generating new forms of wealth and new ways of being so that we don't feel like we never have enough, because I think that's something that was sort of hammered into our DNA as peoples, that we don't have enough, and then there's something that needs to switch. So that would be my question.
Maybe I'll just jump in. Thanks, Joe. And thanks, Paulette. That was incredible. I mean, it's interesting, Sho, you described this panel as like a cake, in the sense of there was different layers. And, you know, like, I feel like I've become okay, at least at like critiquing the forms of like how we perceive wealth, but less well-versed in figuring out like alternative forms of wealth. And so I guess it also depends on how we define wealth, because like, as you mentioned, and as Mahlikah had mentioned as well, like the commodification of things, of the earth, of items, has really, I feel like, overwhelmed our sense of like what wealth can be. And so I don't know, I think I just wanted to point out there that it's interesting to try, it's almost like it's unlearning an entire language of how to relate to the world. I don't know if someone else wants to jump in, but I just wanted to point that out, of how we're talking about wealth.
I think for me, it starts with looking inward. From a Haudenosaunee way, it's like remembering that you yourself are abundant, just as you are. Like, you came into this existence with the gifts necessary to be able to be in community and contribute. We all have gifts, and those gifts are then a part of our path and our purpose, and help guide us to our roles and responsibilities. And I think it starts with, again, the reclamation that I was talking about. We need to reclaim our gifts, from our ancestry, from, you know, the celestial beings. I agree with Paulette. You know, our teachings are the same. We started as star people. So we came into this existence with all of the energies of the universe. How can that not be abundant? You can't even tell me I'm not abundant. And then thinking about how did we used to relate before all of this commodification? We had ways and means to do that. We traded with each other. You know, if my community was the community that, you know, was the gathering community, then my neighbors who were the hunters, you know, would exchange so that we'd all have abundance. We need to get back to the way we used to trade and barter and make in relation to the land. And again, that all my relations, not just how we're relating to each other, but how we're literally relating to all of these relatives. And so again, I think it really starts with ourselves and like re-indigenizing that. And as scary as it is, like, what happens when we begin to divest from these sources of commodification and capitalism? What happens? You can't know until you start doing it, but we can do it. We have the power, and that's what the powers that be are afraid of, that we will actually take up that power again and say, like, I don't really need this. You know, the land actually provides enough for us and our gifts. Why are we invested in this? We need to divest from these systems and reinvest in our communities. That's all I'll say for now.
Paulette, do you want to add something?
Thank you, Sho. I just want to compliment what she has just spoken of. You know, wealth, or the accumulation of things is accumulation of things, but inner wealth is something that exists because what is it about each one of our cultures? What is it about the Japanese culture that is so sacred? What ball of light do you hold? What ball of light do we hold? And how do we come together as cultures if, for example, if Emmy was to bring her ball of light forward, and Sho and Gawa and everyone who's on here, bring your ball of light forward because they know of each other. You can't buy them at a store. You can't recreate what the creator created. It's already original. So with that light, when we bring it forward, that to me is wealth. Don't buy in to what you're being told on how to exist. Let's go forward and let's rewrite the rules with no pen because it's all original anyway. So I believe, or I would like to share, I saw many of your hearts touched today. I saw tears in your eyes. I saw a smile of joy or a smile of remembrance. What remembrance is when truth touches you, it's like sea foam that raises to the top of the ocean, and it feels and smells and tastes a certain way. When you hear truth, you're just remembering your originality, who you really are. That is wealth. It is not seeking after other concepts that are created to profit only a few. True wealth profits us throughout all of time. Thank you.
I think when Mahlikah went over her presentation, I don't know if you said this again, but I just got this image of like our histories and how we've been hurt intergenerationally causes us to really close our fists and hold tight to things and hold tight to identities and, you know, physical things and money and fear. And I think that there's actually this sort of liberation that's waiting when we open our hands. And there's a real liberation in that just being a sign of gratitude, but also in that the more we let go of things, the more they circulate amongst us. And I think that that's very, you know, that sort of hoarding mentality. Like I think my great grandmother in the camps, my family said that she would take food from the mess hall and bury it under her bed every day because she was scared that she wasn't going to have enough to eat. And so, but then sometimes when we have enough to eat, we're still burying that food. And so I think there's something that can happen there when we do start now to give up in the ways that are safe and beautiful. So we're getting to the end of time, but if anyone has any sort of last things they'd like to say to the panelists or each other or any closing remarks, I'd, you know, love to hear just a little message from each of you if you'd like to.
Can I just say one thing, Sho? I feel so woefully inadequate or woefully inadequate. But I think something that just, when Sho, you had actually mentioned this, just like this is me maybe preaching history. But I think what Paulette and Mahlikah and Sho are describing is actually really hard work. And so I think while I just want to highlight that for the community, I'm coming from the Japanese Canadian community, and the layers of histories of, you know, when we talk about even reaching back to Japan to find, you know, our homeland. Japan has a long history of colonization. So much of that Japanese identity is rooted in imperialism. And so I think we can hold both of these things. Like there's so much beauty and liberation that's possible, but I think the root to that is actually so much hard work of confronting really hard truths. And that I really liked what Mahlikah had in those 4 questions. Mahlikah, those are awesome. And I wrote them down, and I might cite you in a tutorial or something of things for people to practice, and kind of denaturalizing things that we suppress. So I think holding both like these really hard realities and these hard histories, as well as, you know, doing that work is actually leading us to a place of abundance and inner wealth, as Paulette was saying. So I just wanted to highlight the difficulty of that, and also everyone, history's great, history's really important, and that's my last pitch to everyone. Thanks, Jo.
I would just like to say it is hard, but anything worth fighting for is not going to be easy. And I'll just add something that Sho said around, you know, this idea of like, you know, giving, you know, the open hands. Just something came to me because, again, as a people, Indigenous people, you know, wealth, our concept of wealth is how much you're able to give, not how much you actually possess. And so when you think of your hands, you know, the outer part of our hands, when we clench our fists, this outer part is the rougher part, it's the harder part. But when you open your hands, you are exposing your palm. The palm is soft and vulnerable. So there's a vulnerability in gifting. And it's not easy because we've been conditioned to believe that if I give you something, I'm losing something, as opposed to when I give you something, I'm gaining something. And that gain is not material in terms of like necessarily something physical. It's actually an exchange of energy. Energy is currency. Again, when we came into this world, we came with the energy of the celestial Untitled, the place in the sky. That's the ultimate currency of energy. And so sharing, anytime you share, you are exchanging on that level. And that's the level that the colonizer doesn't want you to get to, because when you get to it, you're awakened and you're no longer plugged into this matrix of like having to be controlled by materialism and capitalism. So let's open our hands and let's give more. Thank you. Yagoa.
Thank you, Mahlikah. And we're running late on time, but Paulette, if you want to just give us do you want to say a final quick word?
Our hope this afternoon is you feel the gift that is being given to you for the work that you have done and are about to do. The gift of a peoples that, though we have shared past history and experiences, where you go with the gift, the land that you stand on, be full and complete in the land that you stand on here with us, because that is who we are as original people. And as you are here in this land also, that is a power that lies within. I hope that you are accepting the gift today that is being given with all of our hearts and all of our spirits. Gunakshish, thank you, Sho, and all those who are present.
All right, thank you so much, all 3 of you. I feel like the cake metaphor really came through. It's sort of like everyone brought their own ingredients, and now we are all nourished from something that wouldn't have been possible with any of the discrete parts, but together they make something very real. So thank you all for giving so generously. And so, you know, I look forward to just keeping your work, you know, keep checking on those links. And, you know, I know Mahlikah did some performances, which are definitely things I'd recommend checking out. So now we're going to go into breakout rooms, and they will last until 2:50 West Coast time, PST. And the idea is to make sure to share as much space as possible. We don't have a lot of time and we want to hear from everyone's voices. And it is an online format, so there'll be a moderator who will sort of make sure things are on track, but you know, there are some questions we posed, and yeah, hope you can sort of just like take some time to digest the cake for my terrible metaphors continuing, and you know, just sitting with each other and seeing where these teachings might take you, and yeah, but once again, thank you all so much for the generosity with which you shared.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the breakout rooms. We're really looking forward to hearing what questions that you've come up in the Dokana exercise, and the breakout room facilitators will be sharing in order. So over to you, Eddie.
Great. Thank you, Sammy, and I thank you to my breakout room members, Megumi and Emily, and co-facilitator Sammy. So the question that we came up with as our Dokana question is, if you were coming from a place that is reflective of your own inner voice and inner teaching, would you feel like you belong in your community or the space that you occupy? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to my group, Paulette, Angela, Vivian, Janice, Liam, and Teresa. So our question is, when we're thinking about giving and receiving, how do we go beyond thinking about this exchange as transactional? And then our two other questions, which I think are really crucial, especially for the Japanese Canadian community, I think. But one is, how do we receive a gift without the weight of obligation? And Paulette's inspirational question, if we gave everything away, could we still breathe? Thanks.
Emiko Newman's going to share our breakout group.
Thanks, Emmy. So thank you so much to our group. We had a wonderful conversation and some great questions. So what I will share is, if we have received wisdom from our ancestors and recognize this as being priceless, why do we feel that wealth has to be tangible? And how can we move beyond this notion of only tangible wealth?
Okay, and from my group, from Caleb, John, Sho, Chris, Gwen, and myself, Sue, the first question is, what is the capacity of art for understanding and processing our historical relationships, especially the unseen and unrecognized, while acknowledging silences, absences, and losses? And the second question is, how do we take care of ourselves as we navigate the difficult parts of our histories and process or face our whole histories, the blessings and the burdens, in a way that the kindness, goodness, connection can emerge or come from it?
Hello. Thank you to my group as well. I'm sorry that I did not do a good time of timekeeping. Regardless, thank you so much for your contributions. This is group 7 with Mary, Mahlikah, Zia, and Yusei. And the question, which we didn't really have time to discuss which one we would share, I'm going to share the first one that we came up with, which is how might we find our touchstone for the purpose of grounding?
Oh, that's me. We're done. Okay. So I just want to, let me pull up so I know what's going on. So the Paueru dialogues will be taking a 2-month break for the festival season, and will resume in autumn. So the dates will be September 18th, October 16th, and November 20th. And throughout the month of July, the Powell Street Festival will be doing online programming. So you can check out the website to see how you can participate. I believe that there'll be a combination of sort of like live events you can attend, and then things that are just up on the website to sort of take in at your own time, which is great because it'll make the festival accessible to, I think, some folks who wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise. And so I think that's as someone who's been dealing with chronic illness, I think the ability to sort of bring in folks from different places and have different energy levels is a really wonderful thing in this time. So yeah, and just want to thank everyone sort of for being present. You know, I know that we haven't necessarily been in the same physical room, but I felt everyone's energy, and I think that sort of there's some collective consensuses and, you know, understandings that we're reaching, which are really beautiful and will help us sort of, you know, think of ways to not necessarily navigate new terrain, but hold sort of our histories in a different way and with more understanding and respect, so that we can build relations respectfully. And I just going to keep the sort of metaphor of open hands and sort of what that, the freedom and letting go, which is kind of feels like going down a roller coaster or something, you know, you don't, not quite sure where it's going to lead you. But I think the more that I gain sort of my confidence in being able to open those hands and let go, the more I realize that I don't actually hate roller coasters that much. So yeah, so thank you for, especially to Nicole and Mahlikah and Paulette for bringing the rich teachings, and also to the House Street Festival team for bringing us all together in this way. And that's it. I think I'm out.